Imagine standing in an open field under a blistering July sun. To your right and left, 12,000 men are marching, flags flying, drums beating, bayonets gleaming. And ahead of you, a mile away behind a low stone wall, the entire Union army is waiting. You are walking into the mouth of hell. And everyone around you knows it. This is Pickett's charge, the single most catastrophic military gamble in American history, and it happened in 60 minutes. The last gamble, Pickett's charge and the hour that broke the Confederacy. The third day's dawn, a deceptive peace. July 3, 1863. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The morning broke with the strange, suffocating quiet that only follows days of slaughter. For 2 days, the hills and ridges around this small Pennsylvania crossroads town had been soaked in blood. The bodies of young men from Georgia and Maine, from Virginia and New York, lay twisted in the ripening wheat, and among the boulders of a place called Devil's Den birds had stopped singing. The air smelled of burnt powder, iron, and something sweeter and more terrible. Lieutenant Frank Aretas Haskell, aide-de-camp to Union General John Gibbon of the Second Corps, had barely slept. He was 32 years old, a Wisconsin lawyer turned soldier, and in 2 days of fighting he had already witnessed things that no law book, no human language, could properly describe. But somehow, on this bright morning, with the rolling Pennsylvania countryside spread out before him in its summer beauty, there existed a strange and terrible peace. He walked through the Union camp on Cemetery Ridge, picking his way past resting soldiers, sleeping horses, and the low-groaning field hospitals that stretched behind the lines. Men were eating hard crackers, salt pork, coffee boiled black over small fires. They laughed at quiet jokes. They wrote letters home. They sharpened their bayonets. They all knew something terrible was coming. General Robert E. Lee, the gray-bearded commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, had struck the Union flanks on both previous days, the left on July 2 at the Peach Orchard and Little Round Top, the right at Culp's Hill. Both assaults had failed at tremendous cost. What Lee would attempt on this third day was not yet known, but every veteran on Cemetery Ridge had the same quiet, cold feeling in his gut. Lee would come at the center. The last lunch, generals in the sunshine. Around noon, a small gathering took place on the gentle reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge that Lieutenant Haskell would later describe as one of the most surreal moments of his life. General George Gordon Meade, the newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac, he had only taken command 3 days before the battle began, sat down on the grass with Generals Hancock and Gibbon for an informal lunch. Hardtack crackers, canned food, a tin of stewed chicken, passed between the 3 most powerful men in the Union Army at that moment. They talked about ordinary things. One general complained about the heat. Another made a comment about poor coffee. Haskell watched them from a few yards away, struck by the impossible normalcy of the scene. 3 men eating lunch in the sunshine, half a mile from 100,000 enemy soldiers. It was the last quiet moment any of them would have for many hours. Meade had read Lee correctly. He had reinforced the center of his line, a long stretch of Cemetery Ridge protected by low stone walls built by Pennsylvania farmers, never imagining their fences would one day be the pivot of a nation's fate. Behind those walls crouched nearly 7,000 infantry from Gibbon's and Doubleday's divisions, plus the legendary artillery batteries under the command of Brigadier General Henry Hunt. 80 guns. Perhaps more. Loaded, aimed, waiting. Meade told his generals, quietly but with absolute certainty, "If Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be on your front." Gibbon smiled. "I hope so," he said. He would spend the rest of that afternoon praying his confidence had not been arrogance. The sky erupts, the great artillery duel. At exactly 1:07 in the afternoon, the silence was destroyed. 2 Confederate signal guns fired from Seminary Ridge, a mile to the west, and then, as if those 2 shots had cracked the world open, 140 Confederate cannons opened fire simultaneously. It was the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed on American soil. The sound was not like thunder. Thunder rumbles and fades. This was a continuous, crushing roar that pressed against the ears like 2 great hands trying to push a man's skull together. Haskell wrote afterward that the ground itself trembled, that horses panicked and tore their picket lines from the earth, that soldiers who had survived 2 days of infantry combat dropped flat on the ground and covered their heads with their arms, weeping, not from fear, but from sheer physical pain. The shells flew overhead in arcs, trailing smoke. Most of them, fortunately for the Union line, overshot, falling on the rear areas, among the ammunition wagons, the hospital tents, the terrified horses of the artillery reserve. But some found their marks. Men disappeared in explosions of earth and red mist. Limber chests full of ammunition detonated in columns of black smoke 100 feet high. General Gibbon's lunch table, the peaceful spot where, 90 minutes earlier, 3 generals had eaten crackers and discussed the weather, was obliterated by a Confederate shell. For nearly 2 full hours, the barrage continued. Behind their stone walls, the Union infantry pressed their faces into Pennsylvania dirt and waited. There was nothing else to do. You could not fight a cannon with a rifle. You could only wait, and pray, and try not to think about the men being torn apart around you. Henry Hunt, the Union artillery chief, made the decision of his career at this moment. Recognizing that the Confederate guns would eventually run low on ammunition, he ordered his own batteries to slow their return fire, to conserve shells for the infantry assault that Hunt knew was coming. He wanted his guns fresh and loaded when the gray lines crossed that open field. The Confederate commanders saw the Union fire slow, and misread it as success. They believed they had destroyed the Union guns. They had not. The men who would not come back. On the wooded ridge to the west, 3 Confederate divisions were forming up. At the center of what would become the most famous infantry charge in American history stood Major General George Edward Pickett, 38 years old, his long perfumed ringlets curling to his shoulders, his tunic unbuttoned to the waist. Pickett had graduated last in his class at West Point. He was vain, theatrical, deeply devoted to his fiancée back in Virginia, and he had not yet fired a shot in this battle. His 3 brigades, Armistead, Garnett, and Kemper, were fresh, fully manned, and ready. Beside Pickett's division stood the divisions of Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Trimble, men who had already fought and bled on the first day at Gettysburg. They were tired. Their regiments were under strength. Some colonels commanded fewer than 300 men where once they had commanded 800. Together, approximately 12,500 men. Pickett rode to General James Longstreet, Lee's senior corps commander, the man who would give the order to advance, and asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet could not speak. He turned his face away and simply nodded. He believed this attack would fail. He had told Lee so. He had argued, pleaded, suggested alternatives. Lee had overruled him. And so Longstreet, the dutiful soldier, turned his face away from Pickett because he could not watch what he knew was coming. Pickett snapped a salute. "Sir, I shall lead my division forward." He turned his horse toward the tree line. At approximately 3 p.m., the Confederate line stepped out of the woods and into the sunlight. The advance, a mile of open ground. What Lieutenant Haskell saw from behind the stone wall stopped his breath. He would write later that no words had yet been invented that could truly capture it. He tried anyway. The Confederate line emerged from the tree line on Seminary Ridge stretching nearly a mile in width, a perfect, ordered, terrifying formation of gray and butternut, their regimental flags bright in the afternoon sun, their bayonets catching the light and flashing like a river of broken mirrors. They advanced at the quick-step march, shoulder to shoulder, in parade ground discipline, as if they were crossing a parade field in Richmond rather than an open Pennsylvania meadow under the guns of an army. The Union soldiers behind the stone wall watched in absolute silence. Some of them had never seen anything so beautiful. Some of them had never seen anything so terrible. Then Hunt's guns opened. The Union artillery, which had conserved its ammunition precisely for this moment, erupted along the full length of Cemetery Ridge. The first salvos were solid shot, iron balls that skipped across the ground, cutting swaths through the Confederate formations like a scythe through wheat. Men fell in groups of 10 and 15, knocked down in rows. Gaps appeared in the formations, were closed, reappeared. The Confederate advance did not slow. Then the Union guns switched to canister, tin cans packed with dozens of iron balls, that turned each cannon into a massive shotgun. The effect on human beings at close range defied description. Still the gray lines came on. Haskell watched a Union battery commander crying as he fired his guns, not from fear, but from some overwhelming mixture of awe and horror and the terrible mechanical necessity of what he was doing. "Fire!" he screamed, tears running down his powder-blackened face. "Fire! Fire!" General Lewis Armistead, commanding the lead brigade in Pickett's division, placed his black felt hat on the tip of his sword and held it above his head, the signal to his men, "Follow me." His men followed. The angle, where the nation nearly broke. As the Confederate formations crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the halfway point, they began angling toward a specific section of the Union line, a place where the stone wall made a short right-angle jog, creating a corner that the Union troops called the angle. It was here that the storm would break. General Alexander Webb commanded the Philadelphia Brigade holding this section of wall, young, intense, West Point trained. His men had been under continuous fire for 20 minutes. Their ammunition was running low. Several of his battery commanders had already been wounded or killed. Armistead's Confederates reached the stone wall. and went over it. What happened next, in the space of perhaps 15 minutes, was the most savage and decisive close-quarters combat of the entire Civil War. Armistead himself went over the wall, his hat still on his sword, his voice carrying above the roar, "Come on, boys! Give them the cold steel. Who will follow me?" Perhaps 200 of his men followed him over the wall. They captured a Union cannon, the only Confederate unit to do so on that day. For a few terrible minutes, the Confederate flag flew on Cemetery Ridge. Webb's Philadelphia Brigade began to waver. Some men fell back. Officers screamed at them. Webb himself walked up and down the line waving his sword. 3 times he was nearly killed by Confederate fire, trying to hold his men in place by sheer force of will. At this exact moment, the crisis point of the battle, the crisis point of the entire 3-day engagement, perhaps the crisis point of the entire war, Lieutenant Haskell acted. He had no formal authority to command infantry. He was an aide, a staff officer. But he saw Union soldiers falling back from the wall, and he galloped his horse directly into their path, blocking them with his body, screaming at them to turn and fight. He struck soldiers with the flat of his sword. He grabbed men by their collars. He planted himself between the Union retreat and the Confederate breakthrough and refused to move. And slowly, barely, improbably, it worked. The retreating soldiers stopped. They turned. They looked at what they were running from, a few hundred exhausted Confederate soldiers who had just marched a mile under artillery fire and were now, themselves, nearly spent. They went back to the wall. Armistead Falls, the high water mark. General Lewis Armistead stood 100 yards past the stone wall, his hand on the barrel of a captured Union cannon, his sword raised above his head. He was 56 years old. Before the war he had been a close friend of Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, the same Hancock who now commanded the Union troops trying to kill him. The two men had said farewell to each other in California in 1861, both knowing they would end up on opposite sides of the war they both knew was coming. Armistead had wept. He had given Hancock a small prayer book. Now, in this Pennsylvania field, Armistead was shot 3 times, in the arm, and twice in the chest. He collapsed beside the very cannon he had just captured. Union soldiers rushed forward and took him prisoner. He died 2 days later. His last words, reportedly, were asking for his friend Hancock, not knowing that Hancock himself had been gravely wounded in the same battle, carried from the field with an iron nail and a wooden saddle fragment embedded in his thigh. The furthest point that Armistead reached, that small patch of Pennsylvania ground 100 yards past the stone wall, would later be called the high water mark of the Confederacy. It was the farthest north a Confederate army would ever march. From this moment forward, the charge collapsed. Without Armistead's rallying presence, and with Union reinforcements pouring in from both flanks, the Confederate breakthrough at the angle was contained. The men who had gone over the wall were shot, captured, or driven back. The Confederate brigades on Pickett's flanks, never having reached the wall, began to disintegrate under the converging fire of Union infantry and artillery. Men who had marched forward so magnificently now ran. They dropped their rifles. They threw away their equipment. They ran back across that open field, the same field they had crossed with such terrible beauty 20 minutes before, now strewn with the bodies of their comrades, now swept by Union fire that cut down the survivors of the advance. Of the 12,500 men who had stepped out of the tree line, approximately half would not return. The return, Pickett's shattered men. General George Pickett watched his division destroyed from a farmhouse several hundred yards to the rear. He had led the advance to the Emmitsburg Road, then been ordered to the rear by Longstreet to maintain communication with headquarters. He watched through his field glass as his 3 beloved brigades, men he had trained, men he knew by name, were swallowed by smoke and fire. When the remnants began streaming back across the field, Pickett rode out to meet them. General Lee, white-haired and straight-backed, appeared among his retreating soldiers on his gray horse Traveler. He rode among the broken men, steadying them with his presence, speaking quietly, "It is all my fault. It is I who have lost this fight, and you must help me out of it the best way you can." He turned to Pickett, "General Pickett, place your division in the rear for now, for use against any Union counterattack." Pickett looked at him with hollow eyes. "General Lee, I have no division." All 3 of Pickett's brigade commanders had been shot. 2 were dead. 1 was captured. Every one of his 13 regimental commanders was killed or wounded. Of approximately 5,800 men in Pickett's division alone, barely 1,500 returned in fighting condition. Lee never issued the order for a counterattack. There were not enough men left to make one. The field after, a graveyard without markers. As the guns fell silent in the early evening, Lieutenant Haskell walked forward from the stone wall. The field before Cemetery Ridge, the mile of open ground that those 12,500 men had crossed, was now a carpet of the dead and dying. He described it afterward in words that still stopped the breath. The dead were everywhere. In some places they lay so close together that one could walk upon them without touching the ground. They lay in all positions, on their faces, on their backs, in grotesque tangles, some with their hands still reaching forward as if they had fallen while still trying to advance. Their faces were already changing in the July heat. The moaning of the wounded filled the evening air. Union soldiers climbed over the stone wall and moved through the field, giving water to the wounded, Confederate and Union alike. Some Confederate wounded begged to be shot rather than suffer through the night. Some Union soldiers, weeping quietly, obliged. The next morning, July 4, 1863, the 87th birthday of the United States of America, Robert E. Lee began his retreat south toward Virginia. He would never invade the North again. The verdict of history, the high water mark. What did it mean? In the immediate military sense, Pickett's charge was a catastrophe from which the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia never fully recovered. Of the 15 brigades that participated in the assault, all 15 were rendered temporarily combat ineffective. The officer corps of the Confederate Army, the trained, experienced, irreplaceable professionals who had held Lee's army together through 2 years of war, had been gutted. In the larger strategic sense, the defeat at Gettysburg coincided, almost to the hour, with the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi, to Ulysses S. Grant on July 4. In a single day, the Confederacy lost both its best army in the East and its control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was effectively split in two. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years. Hundreds of thousands more would die. But the momentum had shifted, permanently, on that Pennsylvania ridge. The question historians have debated ever since is, why? Why did Lee order an assault that Longstreet believed was suicidal? Some historians argue Lee had been too often victorious, that his string of seemingly impossible triumphs at Chancellorsville and Second Bull Run had convinced him his soldiers could do the impossible. Others argue that Lee was simply wrong on that day, suffering perhaps from the early effects of the heart disease that would kill him 7 years later. Still others argue Lee had no choice. His army was deep in enemy territory, his supply lines stretched thin, and a decisive victory was the only path to the political recognition from Britain and France that the Confederacy desperately needed to survive. Whatever the reason, the charge was ordered. 12,500 men stepped out of the tree line into the July sun. And they walked into the Valley of the Shadow, together, with a courage that left even their enemies awestruck. Haskell, writing days later, tried to make sense of what he had witnessed. The men of both sides were brave enough to walk into fire that no sane man should have walked into. What made the difference was not courage. Both sides had that in abundance. What made the difference was the stone wall, the position on the ridge, and perhaps a few dozen men in a few desperate minutes who refused to run when running was the logical, human, rational thing to do. Among those few dozen men, Lieutenant Frank Haskell modestly did not include himself. He should have. What remained? The stone wall at the angle still stands. You can visit it today in Gettysburg National Military Park. The ground is still there, the same Pennsylvania dirt, the same slight rise of Cemetery Ridge, the same open field stretching west toward Seminary Ridge. In summer, when the wheat is tall and the sky is blue and the breeze comes in warm across the Emmitsburg Road, it is possible, if you stand in the right place and try very hard, to understand what Haskell felt on that July afternoon. The terrible beauty of the thing. The awful human cost. The knowledge that on this quiet ground, for 60 minutes in the summer of 1863, the future of the United States of America genuinely hung in the balance. And that it was saved, in the end, not by grand strategy or superior numbers, but by ordinary men, scared, exhausted, deafened by cannon fire, who chose to stay.